You're watching All 24 News live from Algiers. I'm Karim Zachary and a special coverage of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Here's what's on today. 100 days of a war that is reshaping the world and Europe, a war nobody really believed it would happen, and many analysts concurred. The Russian forces massing on the border were too few to occupy the country. They argued state media had done little to prepare the Russian public for a war. An invasion would trigger economic penalties so ruinous to the Russian economy that no leader would dare risk it. All this was true, and they were wrong. Russia's initial invasion, the hampered advance into Kiev, the retreat and reorientation of its forces, and the assault now underway in Ukraine's east are the different phases this war witnesses. But what's more to come on the ground as Russia is being unpredictable. And the very proof is today's shelling in the outskirts capital after weeks of calm is a pressing concern, along with how effective are the sanctions against Russia and what will Russia do in retaliation. We will raise some of these concerns and other questions with our panel of guests. I am joined live via Skype by Miko Arnodov, international relations expert from Serbia, along with Sergei Yegit, a professor of international relations at New Vision University from Tbilisi, Georgia, via phone. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Let's go on a short break and then we get down to discussion. Before we initiate in the debate, here's what's today's latest. The Ukrainian capital Kiev has been rocked by a number of large explosions this morning. As a regional governor said, Ukrainian forces were pushing back against Russian troops in the strategic eastern city of Sierodonetsk. Mayor Vitali Klitschko said that at least one person was hospitalized, though no fatalities were immediately reported. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Russian President Vladimir Putin warned the West that Russia would strike new targets if the United States started supplying Ukraine with longer-range missiles. Let me commence with you, Mr. Mitko Arnodov. Russia's forces appear to be taking control of the strategically important city of Sierodonetsk in Ukraine's east, as more Western allies promise additional missile systems and arms to Kiev. 80% of the city is now in Russian hands. Capturing Sierodonetsk would give Russia control of all the Luhansk, the region that, with Donetsk, makes up Ukraine's Donbas industrial heartland, consolidating a shift in battlefield momentum. After this, forces were pushed back from Kiev and northern Ukraine. How likely do you think is the loss of Sierodonetsk expected, and how long could the war grind on? As we can discern, missile systems or any kinds of weaponry sent by the West will be the target of Russian attacks.
The battles in Ukraine East are being fought in much more open terrain than the more densely packed urban environment around Kiev. That explains the urgency with which Ukrainians have requested heavy weapons, particularly artillery systems that can strike targets at longer range from the US and its allies. But Moscow at this moment enjoyed a twofold advantage over Kiev in land forces, and the nuclear armed power had 10 times the aircraft and 5 times the armored fighting vehicles of the neighborhood. Last week, President Biden announced that the US will sending more advanced rocket systems, including the high mobility artillery rocket systems with munitions that can launch rockets around 49 miles, a range far greater than anything Ukraine has been sent today. And that's welcome news for Kiev authorities. But Russia offensive in the east is playing out as international media attention on Ukraine recedes somewhat from the headlines. And that may be what Putin is counting on, perhaps mindful that high energy costs and rising consumer prices, both of which have been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, are more likely to concrete public opinion in the United States and elsewhere. Putin may also be counting on short diplomatic attention spans. This is the same Russian leader who doubled down on his support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in 2015 after Damascus suffered a strike of defeat. That war, now entering its 12th year, has continued even as the world attention has shifted to Ukraine. At this moment, it is very difficult to predict what will happen on the ground or in the upcoming period. As we have heard from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman last week, Maria Zakharova, she told that at this moment there is no place for any diplomatic negotiations. But we have to take into account also the Western side, who is continuing to supply Ukrainian forces with additional army, more hard army. What is the point here? The point here is, if we look from a theoretical point of view, we are talking about the theory of nuclear power. What will happen if nuclear power loses the war? In this case, Russia. It could be a pretty big problem on the global level, taking into account that according to nuclear theory, each nuclear power is ready to use its nuclear capacities if it is losing the war in conventional way.
Very nice indeed. And let me now address Mr. Soraya Yigit. The reason Russia engaged in what it calls a special military operation is the Western betrayal of Russia by expanding NATO eastward after the end of the Cold War, ignoring Western security guarantees, and that NATO rules out future membership for Ukraine and other ex-Soviet republics. What's your interpretation for that?
That's certainly the point of view put forth by the Russian Federation. And of course, there is evidence of this with the ending of the Cold War after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. That was the agreement that was made by the West with the Soviet Union, of course, led at the time by Mikhail Gorbachev. That was the idea that NATO would not move eastwards. And if one recalls, there was a debate in the West whether this was the right move or not. And there were some established figures, such as George Kennan, who actually opposed it. But as we all know, that idea was not victorious. NATO did expand eastwards. But while we're looking at NATO expanding eastwards, we must also bear in mind that the new independent states after the collapse of the Soviet Union also had a trajectory that they wanted to themselves initiate. Sovereign states which had been forced to become a part of the Soviet Union, they had reached, they have achieved sovereignty, and of course they wanted to ensure security. And here, of course, we're primarily referring to the Baltic states. So the Baltic states very much wanted to ensure that their territorial integrity would be maintained. And what would be the best way to do this? The best way to do that would be membership within NATO, hence having Article 5 protection, primarily the American nuclear umbrella. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what's happened. Now, the situation here at the moment on the ground, as it were, whereas the Russian Federation and President Putin is complaining about NATO moving eastwards and it would not be permitted to move into Ukraine. That's been made very clear. But having said that, the intention of the Russian Federation of not expanding NATO has backfired. And how do we know this? Because we look and see that NATO is going to expand. It's looking very likely to expand because Sweden and Finland have applied for membership. And this is quite significant, given the fact that Sweden and Finland have been model neutral countries for decades, if not centuries. So that's the point to bear in mind.
That's very nice indeed. Now, moving on, Russian forces have thrown all their forces on the eastern region of their neighboring country. Reports by Ukrainian authorities stated that the Russian army intensified their sporadic shelling on the region after Ukraine's army recaptured some of the territory of their eastern part of the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that the situation in the region remains very difficult against the Russian forces.
The situation in Sierodonetsk, where street fighting continues, remains extremely difficult. It is also difficult in Lysychansk, Marinka, Korokovo. all the cities and communities of Donbass, constant airstrikes, artillery, and rocket fire. To date, the total number of the Russian missiles used against Ukraine is 2,503. The skid of All Saints were burned in Sviatohirsk-Lavra, Donetsk region. It caught fire as a result of the Russian artillery shelling. This is not the first shelling of the Lavra. 3 monks of Lavra were killed by Russian shelling last Wednesday.
Back to you, Mr. Mitko Arnadov. It seems that Biden's deal was for just 4 systems and came with strings attached and was still weeks away from being operational. Biden has made it clear himself that he will not allow a catastrophic failure of Ukrainian defenses. But it is just as evident he has concerns about the implications of catastrophic success. A rout of Russian forces with decisive help of Western weapons, bringing with it the danger of a defense of a defeated Putin lashing out. In addition, the French President Emmanuel Macron himself is admitting that the Western nation failed in dealing with Russia appropriately, and he also underlined that they should not humiliate Russia. As a response, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba reacted on Saturday, saying that such calls only humiliate France and any country taking a similar position or stance. How do you read this overall?
This is the situation where there is no clear coordination between Kiev authorities from one side and from the other side from the authorities for Western countries which are providing support to Ukraine, but only diplomatic and military support. Ukraine now is in the phase of destroying the whole country, especially the eastern and south region, which already do not are under control of Ukrainian forces, although they are still military equipment and military stuff of Ukraine. And the goals seems to be a little bit different. At the beginning, West was talking that they are going to prevent the whole territorial integrity of Ukraine. But situation on the ground shows that even Western countries are talking about some different solutions which would be acceptable in certain time for Kiev authorities. For example, last week American President Biden has said that he is not going to explain or to tell what to Kiev authorities what should they accept as a solution or not to accept as a solution. Similar voices we could heard also from the Western Europe. So that means that Western allies, which are at this moment supporting Ukraine, are opening some space for negotiation, even on the ground on territory, which is totally opposite of that what is asking Kiev. Kiev is trying to prevent the whole territorial integrity on the basis of Western weapons. From the other side, Western countries, bearing in mind the reports from the ground, are talking that there is open possibilities for changes on when we are talking about territorial integrity of Ukraine. At this moment, it is very difficult to predict how it will going because.
But Mr. Mitkovs Arnadov, please. I mean, my question was whether the West failed in dealing with Russia. I mean, that's what Emmanuel Macron was just raising as a concern. Do you see that the West actually failed in dealing with Russia?
Western failed with dealing in Russia in the moment when the military operation has started. Mm-hmm. When the first agreement was not achieved before February 24th, they used all diplomatic mechanism, but they do not use to find a solution with Moscow authorities how to stop the military operation. In that moment, that's the first step when West failed with Russia.
Very nice indeed. Moving on, my second question would be to you, Mr. Soraya Yigit. It is expected that the war is to be protracted, as the issues at stake are existential and not susceptible to compromise. Western support will give Ukraine the means to keep fighting, but both sides will struggle to win a decisive victory. At the same time, it seems that the sanctions implemented against Russia are indeed backfiring on the West and the US in particular. I mean, much social unrest is expected within Western countries. How do you read the West's response to this crisis? And is Ukraine a victim of its own government and the West?
I think it's a good point that you raise. Certainly, the West is suffering. If you're looking at the North America and Western Europe, as you suggested, energy prices have been rising. Of course, we're in the summer now, but energy companies are already indicating that there will be price increases at the time of the autumn and the winter. Petrol prices, of course, risen as well. So that's true. There's definitely challenges with regard to North America and Western Europe. But, your wider question about what is the strategy of the West with regard to Ukraine, I think that should be taken in two ways. First of all, the longer this conflict continues, which side is going to be affected more adversely? Which side is going to suffer more? So if we take it from that aspect, one thing with regard to the Ukraine is, of course, Ukraine is fully dependent on its allies in the West. So to what extent will that Western unity hold over Ukraine over the next few weeks, few months, let's say? So that's an important question. Secondly, and here I'm sort of not looking at the short term, but more to the medium term and the long term. The European Union has already made it extremely clear that it no longer wants to have an energy relationship with Russia. Now, that's not affecting Russia today, but it will affect Russia tomorrow because it's losing a ginormous market and it's going to have major repercussions on the Russian economy. So that's an issue as the conflict continues that Russia is going to have to deal with. Another factor which primarily affects Russia is most analysts did not expect this conflict to take this long. I mean, we're already in day 102. Most people were thinking this would be done in a few days or a week at the most. So that has not taken place, obviously. Now, what is the reason why that has not taken place? Some of the reasons for that is that the Russian military establishment is not as strong as was thought of or considered. There are many reasons why the Russian military is not what it is, but one of them is that similar to the Russian economy, it's also suffering from extremely bad management and corruption and so on and so forth. So the timescale is important for this. And it's a race between the two warring parties, of course. One, can the West maintain its hold? Can it add more sanctions packages on Russia? Can it maintain this unity? And secondly, to what extent can Russia continue its offensive because it's not getting the tangible results that it predicted and it promised its own electorate. So that's the sort of main crux that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. But speaking of sanctions, we see, for instance, today the Marriott hotel chain has announced it is having Russia leaving Russia after 25 years, saying Western restrictions made it impossible. And I get back to you here, Mr. Soraya Yigit. The war marks a geopolitical watershed, as you mentioned, and it will result in Russia's exclusion from the Western economic and political order. How long do you think these sanctions, since you mentioned them, will remain in place? And can Russia find in China and developing world the alternative?
I think it's a very good question. With regard to how long these will take, how long these will continue, if you look at the British point of view, and especially the British Foreign Secretary, she keeps on underlining the fact that these sanctions will continue until this aggression is halted and a return to the status quo is established. So that basically means that until and unless a peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine is signed, which maintains Ukraine's territorial integrity, then these sanctions will be in place. Now, as I said, that's the sort of British point of view, but there's a lot of support for that in the West, although, as you mentioned earlier in your report, with regard to French President Macron, one can't say that there is complete unanimity with regard to this in the whole of Europe. But that's one aspect. With regard to Russia's exclusion from the Western energy markets, that's definitely looking to be implemented and continuing to be implemented unless and until, as I said again, a peace treaty which is acceptable to both sides is signed. Now, Russia, let us not forget, is already heavily dependent on China. Because what happened, if we remember, after 2014 with the sham referendum and the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia turned eastwards with regard to energy exports. And of course, it turned to China. And it turned to China and established a very substantial infrastructural project of exporting oil and gas to China, especially through the Power of Siberia pipeline in the Siberian region. So it's already has already established a very powerful energy relationship with China, and that's going to continue. But what will that mean is China will become the stronger partner in this partnership, and therefore Russia will be dependent on China in terms of its energy exports. And as we know, as an energy exporter, exporters, just like energy importers, prefer diversification. They prefer to have lots of markets, lots of clients, so that they can get the best deal for themselves. So diversification is important for the energy importer, but it's equally important for the energy exporter. Because if you only have a single market, if you only have a single client that you can export to, then your bargaining is not terribly strong. You're going to be a price taker in that respect. Mm-hmm. And in this aspect, Russia will have to accept the price that China offers them. Why? Because they simply don't have any other major customer of the same ilk as China. So that's a major, major problem that Russia is facing at the moment. And as long as this crisis continues, that problem is just going to get more acute.
But how long do you think it will take the West to find alternative for Russian energy products, seeing that many other European countries even actually were against the boycott or the embargo on Russian oil?
Absolutely. I'm sure you've been following, and your viewers have been following, that Hungary has made statements with regard to gas being exempt from European Union sanctions or exemptions being given to certain EU member countries which are heavily dependent on Russian energy imports. Now, in the short term, it's not easy. It's extremely difficult to diversify energy imports, but there are alternatives, some of which, of course, are increasing gas imports from North Africa, others, of course, from the Caucasus and Central Asia, especially when we're looking at countries such as Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, the possibility of initiating a trans-Caspian pipeline to actually import gas and oil from Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan via Azerbaijan and Turkey onto the European market. So there certainly are viable alternatives, which the European Union had been thinking of and considering. But of course, now this has become much, much more important, almost existential in fact, especially for those countries which are heavily dependent on Russian energy sources, such as Germany.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. Mr. Mitko Arnaudov, I get back to you. With the sanctions persisting, the West will have to reorganize its global supply chains, including for commodities supplied by Russia. Ukraine and the wider region will remain a zone of instability for many years to come. What's your reading?
What will happen? We could not expect anything good in the upcoming period. So the destabilization of the eastern part of Europe, including Ukraine, will follow us in the next probably 1-2 years. I'm not sure when the battle will stop on the ground. We cannot talk at this moment about stabilization of the situation, but it would create big expenses not only for Ukraine and for Russia, but also for on the global level, including European Union. Expenses would be very big, taking into account also the colleague what has said. The diversification on the energy market is very slow process. It could not happen in 1 year or in 6 months.
But Mr. Mitko Arnaudov, who's to blame about these global crises, including food and energy crisis? Is only Russia here to blame, or perhaps the West couldn't just messed up dealing with this issue?
Taking into account the international community is based in its position on many actors. So international community is creating many actors. Both sides have fault what is happening at this moment, because both sides were not or were aware what will happen if the start is going to begin. Now we are facing with this war situation. Even we are having people are scaring whether war could spread more on the territory of Europe. So we cannot say at this moment the fault is on Moscow side or the fault is on the west side. Both sides have responsibility for this what has happened, because they are included in international society, they are included in diplomatic system.
For example, Mr. Mitko Arnodov, when we speak about, for example, food crisis, we see that Ukraine has actually mined the ports, and we cannot get any ships actually to leave with supplies to countries that need it the most. For example, poor African countries. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we see the oil embargo, which actually raised the energy crisis and thus causing many other commodities to raise in prices. All this, isn't it because of the sanctions or the Western sanctions?
Both sides have guilties, because Russia has started the military operation. The response from West side was sanctions, in order to not enter in direct military fight with Russian Federation. They have decided to start with sanctions. So the situation is in this moment is for both sides are losing. Russia is losing because he is marginalized of international society. He could not be included in making decision process on international level on all topic, economic, political, security topics. From the other side, West have decided not to take direct part of the war, but imposed economic sanctions, which was aware when exposing of economic sanctions, it would have a great influence also on their economies.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about the sanctions and the consequences, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday that the terrible consequences of the war could be stopped if Moscow ordered its troops to stop fighting in eastern Ukraine. Let's listen.
This can no longer be fixed, because this war is already going on. But terrible consequences of this war can be stopped at any moment. The Russian army can stop burning down churches. The Russian army can stop destroying cities. The Russian army can stop killing children. If one person in Moscow simply gives such an order. And the fact that there is still no such order is obviously humiliation for the whole world.
Mr. Sharia, the longer the war drags on, the greater the risk the West is being pulled in, either as a result of military miscalculation by either side or of the war accidentally spilling over into a NATO member state. How do you see this? How likely is this?
That's a very credible scenario, hence the firm resolution by NATO to make its intentions very clear from the beginning, saying that no-fly zones were not an option, because that would lead to a very credible situation whereby you would have Russian air forces attacking NATO air forces. I think the whole strategy of the Western alliance is to make sure that, number one, of course, this war does not spread outside of the Ukraine, which it hasn't already, and it looks unlikely to at the moment. And of course, the secondary aim is to end the conflict as soon as possible and to achieve territorial integrity for Ukraine is the official line, as I mentioned earlier. But of course, there are cracks in this, and I'm sure you're aware. A few days ago, Henry Kissinger also made a statement saying that when the time comes, that Ukraine will be forced to make some territorial concessions. So there are quite important personalities who are putting this forward. It's too early to say at the moment, because peace treaties, peace negotiations have a dynamic all on their own. And hence, by the time that peace negotiations take place, you have to be strong on the ground, which is the reason why both parties, both Ukraine and Russia, are doing their utmost to gain as much leeway as possible in terms of territory before sitting to credibly negotiate.
Yes, Mr. Soraya Yigit, it seems that many press on the idea that prospects for negotiated agreement are really slim. Even if a peace deal materializes, a stable, durable settlement is unlikely, isn't it?
I think it is unlikely. I think we are in the throes of a new Cold War. We're already in a new Cold War, because these two poles have re-emerged. You have a Western pole, which is democratic, liberal, free market, opposing this very authoritarian, but an aggressively authoritarian actor at the moment, because Russia before February of this year was not a model democracy which operated within the rule of law and respect of human rights. But one thing that one can say is, of course, before February, it was not an aggressor. It had not invaded a neighboring country. So that has changed the geopolitical situation. And it looks highly likely that we will be entering into a different phase of a new Cold War.
Yeah, understood, Mr. Surayigit. Now, as a final question, and just to wrap it up, Mr. Mitko Arnodov, what's the risk of a much more serious global conflict in here, according to you? And how do you see a way out, very briefly, as we come to the end?
We cannot expect global conflict. Also, big powers are aware, huge powers, that it could not happen because of their national interest, not because of Ukraine or because of small countries. And this war will continue on this level, and it will end maybe in the next 6 months, 1 year. And the final solution also will be on the diplomatic way. This is no new, we are not entering in new Cold War. We are entering in new phase of international relations, which will be composed of many different blocks based on economic level. So the West will refocus its economy on energy market before all. The Russia will refocus its economy with other Asian partners, and we're going to create one different economic global picture after
understood,
this.
Mr. Mitkov or Mitko Arnodov. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. It's the end of our program. Bye for now.